In 2008, Marco had just moved to a new city. He didn't know anyone, the streets were anonymous and his days passed slowly and lonely. The idea of having someone to share his new life with became more and more insistent, until he decided to adopt an animal to keep him company. Leafing through a local newspaper, his eye fell on an ad from a shelter looking for new owners for dogs left without a family. Without thinking twice, he went to the shelter. When he got there, he found himself surrounded by dozens of dogs, all with different stories, all looking for a second chance. Some had already been adopted and were just waiting to be taken home, others were huddled in the corners of their cages, fearful. But among them, one in particular caught his attention, a black Labrador, with a deep and melancholic look. His name, they told him, was Leo. "He's a good dog," a volunteer explained, "but it might take him a while to settle in." He had a complicated history. Marco didn't think twice. He signed the papers and took Leo home, convinced that in a few days they would become great friends. But not everything went as hoped. Leo didn't respond to commands, didn't seem to recognize his name, and even destroyed a pair of Marco's shoes. The first few weeks were a nightmare. Marco tried to teach him how to behave in the house, but the dog seemed disoriented, as if he didn't understand where he was. He tried to escape, scratched the door every time Marco went out, and howled on full moon nights. The nights were sleepless. Leo wandered around the house without ever really stopping. He didn't bark, but his gaze said more than 1,000 words. Marco watched him, tried to interact with him, but it seemed like he could never really reach him. After 2 weeks of frustrating attempts, Marco began to think he had made a mistake. Maybe that dog would never grow fond of him. He was about to pick up the phone and call the shelter to return it, when his eyes fell on an envelope among the items delivered by the shelter. It was a letter from Leo's previous owner. He opened it with curiosity, not knowing that the letter would change his life. "To whoever you are, Leo's new owner." Marco read the letter with bated breath. Every word seemed like a weight resting on his heart. He couldn't believe that Tank had belonged to a soldier who had fallen in war. He imagined that man at the front, with his dog always at his side, protecting him and keeping him company in difficult moments. Marco remained still with the letter in his hands. Now he understood. He looked at the Labrador who, unaware of everything, was crouched a few meters away from him. With a trembling voice, he said, "Tank, come here." The dog's ears perked up. He raised his head, as if a forgotten sound had suddenly come back to him. Then he stood up and ran towards Marco, jumping on him and licking his face. From that moment on, their bond changed. Tank seemed like another dog, obedient, attentive and, above all, finally calm. Marco realized that the problem was not the dog, but his name. He needed to hear his real name called to trust again. Every day, Marco took Tank to the park, where the dog could run free and play with the other animals. He noticed that he loved watching the planes in the sky, almost as if he was waiting for someone. Perhaps his old owner. One evening, Marco decided to take him to the hill behind the house. The sky was clear and full of stars. He sat down on the grass and petted Tank, who crouched down next to him. "I wonder if your old master is watching us from up there," Marco whispered. The dog raised his head, as if he understood. From that day on, everything changed. Tank responded to commands, followed him everywhere, and seemed to have finally found serenity. But there was still one thing Marco wanted to try. He picked up 3 tennis balls and showed them to Tank. Tank wagged his tail, excited. Marco threw the balls, and the dog ran to pick them up. When he returned, he had 3 balls in his mouth. 3. Marco smiled with tears in his eyes. He knelt down next to Tank and hugged him tightly. At that moment, he knew they were no longer alone. One day, Marco decided to do something special for Tank. He went to the military cemetery and found his old owner's grave. It was covered in flowers and flags, a sign that no one had forgotten him. Marco knelt down next to the gravestone, and Tank followed him, resting his head on the stone. "Thank you for leaving me your best friend. I promise I will protect and love him like you did," Marco said. At that moment, he felt the wind blowing through the trees. It was just a coincidence, or maybe a sign that the old soldier was really watching them from up there. Many believe that adopting an adult dog is difficult, that it will never become attached to a new home. But they're wrong. Everyone deserves a second chance. And Tank had finally found it. And so had Marco. After the visit to the military cemetery, Marco and Tank's life had transformed into a peaceful and satisfying routine. Every morning, Marco woke up knowing he wasn't alone, and Tank, with his tail wagging, greeted him with an affectionate lick. Walks in the park had become a daily ritual, a moment of relaxation and socialization for both of them. Tank ran free, chasing squirrels and playing with other dogs, while Marco enjoyed his company, watching him with a smile. Marco had learned to know every nuance of Tank's character. He knew when he was happy, when he was sad, when he needed comfort. He had discovered that Tank especially loved scratches behind the ears and that he loved munching on raw carrots. He had also noticed that, despite his apparent serenity, Tank retained a hint of melancholy, a thoughtful look turned to the sky, as if he were looking for something or someone. One evening while Marco Tank was sitting on the hill, watching the stars, Marco decided to tell Tank the story of his old master. He told him about the soldier, his courage, his love for his dog. He described the battles, the hardships, the loneliness. Tank listened intently, his head resting on Marco's knees, as if he understood every word. When Marco finished, a thick silence fell on the hill. Only the rustling of the wind in the trees broke the stillness. Tank stood up, walked to the edge of the hill, and stared out at the horizon. Marco walked over to him, put a hand on his shoulder, and said, "I know you miss me, Tank. But I'm here now. And I love you." Tank turned, looked into his eyes, and licked his hand. In that moment, Marco knew that Tank had accepted his love, that he had found a new home, a new family. In the months that followed, the bond between Marco and Tank grew even stronger. Marco had decided to dedicate his life to Tank, to give him all the love and happiness he deserved. He took him with him wherever he went, to work, to the supermarket, to the restaurant. Tank had become his shadow, his inseparable companion. One day, Marco decided to take Tank to a center for war veterans. He wanted Tank to meet other people who had been through similar experiences to his old owner. Tank behaved impeccably, approaching the veterans with caution, offering them comfort and affection. Many of them were moved, remembering their fallen comrades, their dogs, their friends. Marco realized that Tank had a mission, to bring comfort and hope to those who had suffered. He began to take him regularly to the Veterans Center, and Tank became a true therapy dog. His presence was a balm for the wounds of the soul, a ray of sunshine.